Hi, I'm Joe.
And I'm Liz.
This is Joe's Table, where we talk about role-playing, game design, hobbies, project planning, world building, and all things creativity.
So today we're going to talk about doing role-playing games one-on-one. So this would be a game where you have one player and one GM. This is something we do for a number of different reasons. One of those was, for a while, we moved away from a number of the people that we like to role play with. And this was before things like Roll20 and other online ways to do that. So we were multiple states away from all of our friends that we wanted to role play with. And we struggled to find a group in our area that we would want to role play with because, see some of our previous episodes, but we're more narrativist gamers. And a lot of the role playing groups we were seeing and finding were very much more interested in strategic or gamist sorts of role playing, so we knew that we just wouldn't have a good fit with those groups. One of the other big reasons we got into one-on-one role playing is we really wanted to tell very specialized, intimate stories that you just can't do with a bigger group. So something that's incredibly tailored to the other person and what the other person is looking for in a story.
Okay, so I think first off, we're going to talk about some advantages and disadvantages, and then we can talk about the specifics of implementing one-on-one role-playing in individual systems and kind of how that has worked for us, and also how to actually accomplish it. We'll leave kind of the specifics for later and talk more about the overarching stuff to begin with, I think.
So as I said, one of the big advantages of doing a one-on-one role-playing game is really that you can customize your story to what the other person wants. So rather than having to work in multiple different players and all of their characters' backstories,
which we totally think that you should be doing if you're running in a group, but
this allows you to really customize something, though. So if you've got a story, especially something that maybe the rest of the group that you normally role play with isn't very interested in, but you've got one person who's very interested in doing, say a Art Nouveau Japanese adventure, something
that sounds rad.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. Like I'd totally run that. But that way you can do something just for that one person.
Yeah, because a lot of the time there's kind of a group mindset that sets in with a large group of role players that isn't necessarily, it's kind of like, I guess it's almost like a design by committee kind of effect, where it's like everybody has to kind of compromise a little bit on what they want out of the thing in order to get everybody on board with it, if that makes a certain amount of sense. Because kind of like it's the typical D&D fantasy land seems like it's kind of the de facto standard, and kind of everybody can kind of agree on that. But if like only one person say wants to play like a science fiction setting, then it's easier to just do that one-on-one if that's the only person who's interested in it. Another convenient advantage of one-on-one role playing is that you can be more intimate and specific about the stories that you want to tell. Like not just that you can tailor the game to them, but like tailor the story itself and say like, I want this story to feel more like an anime or like a fantasy novel where there is a main character, right? And that main character's background and their story is the story of the game, as opposed to like in a lot of tabletop role-playing games. And I try to fight this as much as I can. I try to make my games as much about the players as I possibly can, even when it's a bunch of characters. But it's really hard to make everybody the main character when you've got 4 or 6 or whatever players playing the game.
Yeah, and this really allows you to tailor that story specifically to that main character, and potentially for that player, some different things that they want to explore. Maybe it's a character design that they really want to explore and dig into and say, what would it be like to be the chosen one?
Yeah.
Or
foreshadowing.
Yeah. We'll talk about that later. And you can really have some very interesting, compelling tearjerker stories that you couldn't do with a group as easily, because you'd have to try to balance 4 or 5 people and their characters and their backstories and all of that stuff and their investment. Like this way you can really make it specifically what's going to work for that one person and what's going to get that one person's character through this, arc that you both want to tell. It's kind of like writing a book for that person, but just as you go organically.
You're sort of co-writing it, right? Because you're saying like, I'm going to produce some kind of content for this character to struggle in, and then they're providing like how that character accomplishes the stuff that they feel that they need to accomplish and which direction that they want to go, which is like, I don't know, it's really satisfying. I think as a GM and as a role player, it can be, in my opinion, it can be more satisfying than a lot of group games, because you do feel like you're the one in charge. You feel like you're the main character, and you get to have that kind of escapist, like hero fantasy almost, right? Or whatever the character's story is. You get to participate directly in that, and that's really cool. So another advantage that we think that one-on-one role-playing has is that you can tell more interesting stories with that archetype. And I don't mean that like you can't tell interesting stories with, a group. What I think I mean is that you're more open to different story structures when you're dealing with a one-on-one kind of role-playing situation. You can do things that aren't really available to you in group play, because you need to like keep everybody together and you need to keep the game organized around those people. And frequently there are like meta considerations for how those characters need to be handled and put together in the scene or just in the game generally. It becomes a thing where you have to intentionally keep the party together, even if there are characters who disagree with each other. And frequently it's like, well, we're a group, we're some kind of specific group thing, some kind of group entity or like a team. And so it becomes a story about like, it necessarily becomes like a story about how the team does team things, as opposed to like any of the different kinds of stories you can tell about a single character. You can do like a man versus nature thing. You could totally like do a single ranger surviving out in the wilds, which is just not a thing that you would be able to do in a normal D&D game with 4 people or whatever. But you could also do things like a very deep psychological horror kind of thing that would just not work very well with a group of 4 people. I mean, there's tons of examples. I think those are the only 2 that I can think of, like just off the cuff.
Yeah.
You mentioned the chosen one kind of effect too. That you can do that in a group of 4 people, but you really need some good buy-in from everybody to make that work, because it's very easily going to be like the Joe show or whatever.
Yeah.
And then everybody else's side characters,
or you've got fun. You've got the chosen 4 instead of the chosen 1, and that just gets awkward. So one of the other big advantages of one-on-one role-playing is less chaos.
Yeah.
With parties, it can be pretty easy. Everybody has different ideas. Everybody has different, things that they want to do, backstories, characters, things like that. So you can very easily get into, chaos. Plus, when you get a group of creative people together, you're going to have some very creative and crazy solutions to stuff, or you're just going to wander off. I think it's a little easier with one-on-one role-playing to keep on story. Right. Because you've got one person dictating the story, basically. Right. You've got your one player who's it's their path through, so you won't have anybody who's really getting lost. Right. Well, and I think that's also like not necessarily that people will get lost in a normal D&D game, but that it's a series of, it's like a constant series of compromises, right? Like it's like, oh, well, the fighter character says we should beat the shit out of these guys, and the rogue character is like, dude, they're fine. Like I'm chaotic neutral. I agree with these guys or whatever. And then the cleric's like, they're all damned and they should be set to the flame or whatever. Like then they have to that entire group has to spend every single social encounter trying to figure out like who feels what about which option and what are we going to do about it, right? Like there's not that fundamentally feels like a different kind of storytelling than the storytelling that you would be used to in like an anime about several characters, or like a fiction novel about several characters, or like a TV show or whatever, where
the things that those characters feel might not overlap and they might disagree about stuff, but it's like it doesn't damage the overall structure of the story kind of thing.
Yeah.
With lots of player characters who are devoted to how their character feels, it becomes very complicated very quickly. And so that can kind of, since it's a compromise, like some people are going to enjoy parts of that and then other people are going to not enjoy parts of that.
Yeah. And the risk is, sometimes you'll get players who just kind of zone out because what they want to do is not what the rest of the group wants to do. So they're not represented. Or
the converse of that. Sometimes the GM will do a side quest specifically for one character and then everybody else is just kind of tagging along. I've had that happen a fair amount where it's just kind of, oh, well, I guess we're going to go do that guy's thing now. And then everybody else is just sort of an appendix.
Yeah. And with one-on-one role-playing, there's no appendixes. Like what your side quest is what the main quest is with the story, which is really nice.
Right.
Yeah.
I would also kind of add as an addendum to the less chaos thing is that I struggle with this a bit because I like to tell dramatic stories that have like weight and meaning.
Yeah.
And I like to do that. And I like to have those kind of stories when I'm as a player. Right. And I feel like that can also be kind of that drama is undermined by the chaos of multiple characters trying to figure out multiple different things at the same time. So like, imagine I'm going to take an example from like one of the unrecent game that I played in. One of the like a paladin's brother turned out to be like the main villain, and he was having this big moment, right? Like everybody we had gotten ready for this big ultimate fight with the villain, and it was like, oh my god, that's that guy's brother, and like they had like a counter monologue thing. They were like trying to talk each other down, and it was great. And then like one character was just kind of like over in the corner, like dicking around meaninglessly, and it was like, you are totally ruining the moment here, I get that you're bored, and I get that your character might be bored, but like we're having a moment.
Read the room. Yeah.
So yeah, that kind of thing happens a lot. I mean, it can happen much more easily in group role playing than it can in one-on-one role playing. Like it's much easier to stay on track and kind of read the room when there's only one other person that you have to communicate with.
Yeah. And that's not to say that there won't be chaos.
Right.
If your player wants chaos, you can have as much chaos as you want. Or sometimes you'll unintentionally have chaos just crop up because of like a series of really bad dice rolls or something like that.
Or really poor decisions.
Yep. Or bears.
And sometimes there's just bears.
Yeah.
The next thing that I think that one-on-one role playing has as an advantage is that it's much easier to get buy-in. This is sort of similar to the fundamental problem of less chaos or more chaos with a group, but it's much easier to get the buy-in of like one person than it is to get the buy-in of like 4 or 5 or 6 people, because those 6 people are just fundamentally going to have different ideas. And since they have to play different characters, it's really hard to kind of keep everybody on the same page and say like, okay, well now I have to construct a story around the wizard, the cleric, the paladin, and the rogue, and we have to keep them all on a team and make them want to do the same thing. Now, like from the like gamist, like traditional D&D standpoint, like the thing that you would say like all those characters want to do is go fight monsters and get treasure, right? Like it's very like, no, yeah, we're totally here to play the adventure kind of thing. But that's quite different from a narrativist point of view where you want to be talking about what these characters' story is, right? Like the story of each of those characters could be quite different. Yeah. Just because of the presumptions of their classes, right?
And I think the other thing that really helps with buy-in on a one-on-one role-playing game, or at least the ones that we've done, is a lot of the ones we've done have come from an idea that we've had of, hey, wouldn't it be cool to play this sort of a game in this sort of a world, to do, this type of a story. And so I think it's much easier as a player to have buy-in into it because that's the story you want to
right.
to be part of. And that's the story you really want to be invested in. So you're just automatically really, bought into that. And there's no waiting for somebody else's backstory stuff and waiting for somebody else's side quest. Like, it's all you. You can be greedy.
Yep.
It's everything that you want.
Be the greedy
in one
little
story.
dragon.
Yeah.
And suck up all the cool stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even when things go sideways for your character, it's not like you've lost the thread, because I can feel sometimes when you're playing with a lot of, especially players who like are really into their own characters, what happens is you almost feel like you're passing around the I'm the main character baton. And so like, or a crown, like one person can wear the crown at a time, and it's like if you screw up your thing or fail a roll, then sometimes it feels like you somebody else takes the crown and now it's their story, and you're like, well, I wanted to get my thing done. Oh, it's not my turn anymore, kind of thing. Okay, so let's talk about the disadvantages. We've really kind of talked up one-on-one role playing quite a bit here, but there are some disadvantages, and I guess the first one that I can think of is that this is not available to a lot of players who don't have this kind of a relationship available to them in their lives. Like with me and Liz, I mean, we live together, we're married, we, as we mentioned in previous podcasts, we can like have a discussion about a cool idea in the morning during a shower or something, and then be like ready to play that thing in the evening or whatever. If you don't live with that person, then it becomes more communication to discuss those things. But also if you just don't have a single friend that you like to role play with in that intimate of a setting, then likewise, it can be difficult to set that up. And even if you have a bunch of D&D friends, you might find that nobody really wants to be like that close, I guess. Like that, it's like I want to hang out with the group, right? I don't want to. Some people just want to play with the group as opposed to get their perfect story out.
Yeah, and this can be, for a GM, more work too,
right.
I think. So that's the other thing, is like having somebody who can run the game, who's willing to put in the work to actually do that, because this is a more intimate storytelling thing. So you do have to have a more in-depth world. You do have to have more content, more idea of, what might occur. You have to plan a little bit more, because you're going to get through more material.
Right.
You're not going to
can't rely on the players screwing around to eat up game time per session.
Yeah, definitely. You're going to be moving through stuff a whole lot faster. So that does make it a little bit more difficult to find somebody who's interested in running that sort of game with you, or playing in that sort of game.
The other thing about it is that it's much easier to let a game drop. It's very frequent that you can start one of these things, and then if both players, or the GM and the player are losing interest in it, then it will just literally evaporate before your eyes, because you don't have, there's a certain amount of like scheduling momentum, right? Like when you say we're going to play this game for, on Sunday afternoons or whatever, and like 6 people are coming and one person has to bring the snacks and then one person is like planning the dinner or whatever. It's much harder for the entire group to just sort of give up on that, because there's like social expectations going around between everybody. But when those social expectations are like between 2 people and neither one of them is that interested anymore, then like an off day can just basically kill the game.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and it's a lot easier with a group if one person, has an off day or has a family obligation. You've still got, 4 other people or 3 other people, and you can still pull something together. But when it's just 2 people, it's and one of them bails, like that's it.
Game over, right?
Yeah.
Game over, man. Game over.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, if somebody, it's also more difficult if somebody's just not feeling it anymore, to just let it kind of die out, because you both have to be very invested in it. You can't rely on, somebody else to kind of pick up the slack on the days that you're not feeling that interested in the game.
Right.
So you do have to have, I think, a bit more of a conversation between the GM and the player, to say, you know, are we just having a bad day here where I'm not feeling it, you're not feeling it, you know, something like that? Or are we losing interest in the game?
Right.
You know, do we need to just cut this one
Right.
off and wrap it up? So,
because sometimes it'll turn out that after having played a few sessions that, and this is true of like any role-playing game, sometimes it'll just turn out that you're not that interested in how the game is going, right? Sometimes the story will take a turn, or your character will take a turn, or the mechanics will take a turn, and you'll be like, well, I'm losing just interest in in that part of the thing at this point. And if that happens, especially in a one-on-one, then it's much easier to just let that thing go.
yeah. And I'd say we're kind of at 60-40 between the two of us. Like 60% of our games, one-on-one games, we get really invested in. And, you know, they're some of the best games we've ever done,
Right.
some of the best stories we've ever told. And the other 40%, we just kind of don't feel them, and they just evaporate. And, you know, due to various reasons, we just give up on them.
Right.
So, and that's okay.
Yeah, I guess I'm not super mad about that, because like we play them as much as we enjoy them, right? Like if we stop enjoying them, then we don't play them. So we're not like forcing ourselves. And I guess maybe that's the reverse side of that coin, as turning that disadvantage into an advantage. Sometimes you can get stuck in a game that you are not feeling because you want to hang out with your friends and you want to play D&D with your pals. And then it's like, oh, well, it turns out that I don't like playing in modules, or it turns out that I don't like playing a wizard or whatever. Yeah. And we need a wizard, or we're just going to play modules. And this allows you to kind of cut the thing loose much more easily if you're not enjoying it, which is, I guess, a strength.
It also allows you to try different things out a little easier.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you can, you know, be like, maybe I want to try science fiction. I've never done that before.
Right.
Rather than investing in, you know, a year's worth of role playing with a group, or feeling like you're going to let the group down if you don't like it eventually.
Right.
Like, you can just do something really quick for a couple of weeks and say, do I like this? Do I want to do more of this? Or is this just not the right thing? So,
yeah. And I would say also that you should probably think about that when you're setting up games with groups too. Consider that if it's something somewhat outlandish and people are kind of like tentatively interested, or like several people are super excited and several other people are like, yeah, I could play that, then like set that up, do that in your session 0 and say like, look, maybe we're only going to play this for like a month or 2 months or something. And then we'll check in again later on to see how we're doing and whether we want to keep playing this. Because just having that conversation at the beginning diffuses some of that like feeling that you have to keep the game going, because you don't really have to keep the game going. Nobody really has to keep the game going. It's a hobby, right? It's a thing that you could let drop. So let's not keep ourselves tied to things that we need not be tied to if those things are getting unfun for everybody involved.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
That's the golden rule after all.
So one of the other things that can be a disadvantage with one-on-one role playing is mechanically it can be more difficult in traditional systems. Most systems are geared towards having a group of players. They come in with the idea that you will be having at least 3 to 4 players plus a GM when you're running a game. And so they're structured around that, you know, sort of a setup. So, you know, if you're talking about like 5th edition, the CR for monsters is all structured around that. So trying to figure out like the CR for one player versus monsters gets very difficult.
Right.
It makes everything really swingy. And there's a lot of other systems that have that same problem where, you know, one player will just kind of wreck all of the balancing that's been done in the game to try to make it work out right. And that can be very difficult.
Yeah, because a lot of these, what we call traditional games that inherit their structure and play style from D&D, especially in the early days, those kind of games are fundamentally designed for party play. They're designed so that your character has gaps. We've talked about that in the past in previous podcasts, especially in the D&D podcasts. A lot of these traditional games are designed so that your character is a part of a team, and is fundamentally not capable of handling all the situations at all times, and that you need other people there to help you out. They're like, conversely, you could totally play a game of like Fate or possibly Apocalypse World or Dungeon World or something like that by yourself. Those might be better systems for that sort of thing. And that's not really, I would hesitate to call that a problem with those systems, because they're just designed to do the thing that they are designed to do, right? Like, we're not ragging on D&D. We're just saying, like, this is how it's supposed to work. This is what they designed it for.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And you can pull that off in D&D. There are certain character builds that you can do. You want to make sure you've got somebody who's much more of an all-around, who might have access to some healing, who might have access to some magic or, sword fighting, skills and stuff like that. It is possible. It's just a lot more difficult in something like D&D.
Especially at the starting levels. It's probably a lot easier towards the middle and higher levels when you just have more resources to throw around. But at the very early levels, since few people start at a higher level, at early levels, you just practically can't even find monsters low enough in CR to not kill a single character in one-on-one combat, let alone having a first level character fight a couple of orcs at a time. So it gets really weird, because then you're like talking about a character who's like, oh yeah, I'm going to struggle and become a hero. And you're like, oh, you managed to kill one rat. Good job. Woo-hoo.
Yeah. Or you have to do what we did with one of our games, where we had, I had one main character that I was playing, but then in combat, I was actually running like 3 or 4 characters at the same time, which was a lot to balance.
Right. And you did it really well. You were able to keep a lot of those characters pretty straight, and were able to actually make use of a lot of their different powers and stuff. So kudos to you, but it is like a lot of extra work.
Yeah. I learned a ton from that, actually. I think, we kind of lost interest in the story, and it was really starting to get to be a lot of work when we got higher up in level. I think it actually really helped me learn a lot about different classes that I wouldn't normally play. So, positive effect there, but boy, was that a lot of work to do that for all, 4 or 5 different characters during combat, and to be like, okay, so what does the rogue do? What can the warlock do? What does the fighter do? And like, how do I utilize that all at the same time? Like, you don't get that downtime in between. Right.
You never get, as the player, at that point, you only get to rest and try to plan things out when the GM is taking their turn. Which, like, I know that me as a player, I like to sit there, and once I'm done with my turn, I'm already planning the next turn, planning my actions for the next go around, because now I'm like paying attention to who's doing what's the status of the bad guys, like who has put any temporary effects in play, or given us advantages that I can prey upon, and then by the time my turn rolls around, then I can just jump on that stuff. And it's like, when you're one-on-one role playing with D&D characters, there's so much crunch that you basically just have to sit there and think about how things are going to work for you and this whole team for 10 minutes, and work your way through that and be like, okay, what if I have this person do this and then have this person do that, and then we're going to chain this effect. So yeah.
So there's, like, once again, we're not saying D&D is a bad system. It's just not the right system for one-on-one role playing in most cases. Something like Fate or Apocalypse World or Silcore or something like that would be a much better choice in those cases, because they can be scaled down a lot easier than D&D can be.
And I will say, conversely, for that particular campaign where you were playing multiple characters, the advantage there was that I could plan the encounters normally, like, because you had a normal amount of characters. So the bookkeeping on my end was basically the same that it would have been for any other game. It's just that it was a lot of extra bookkeeping on your end, because you needed to keep a lot of those characters straight in your head as to what they were capable of doing.
So with that said, I think all of our one-on-one role-playing games, all the ones that we really enjoyed, all of the ones that were really long-running, none of those were in D&D.
Right. Just empirically, the data say that we don't do one-on-ones in D&D very, very well.
Yeah, we've made a few attempts to them, and I think the one that we were talking about where I was running multiple characters in combat, that was the longest running D&D one-on-one game. The rest of them, it didn't work out. We just couldn't make it work more than a couple of sessions.
Yeah. I'm thinking of Rosa. I can't remember. I mean, I honestly can't even remember a lot of the other ones because there was the Magic School one. That one lasted for 5 or 6 sessions.
That one did. And there was another one that we did right when 4th edition came out, I think, to try 4th edition out.
Right. Yeah.
And all I remember is, an inn and a town.
Yeah.
And that's about as far as we got. So it just didn't work out how we wanted it to.
Right. And so conversely, of the games that we've played one-on-one that we really did enjoy, at least 2 of the best ones were in Silcore.
And we'll talk more about Silcore in a later podcast,
right,
and what the system is like, because it's not a very commonly used one.
Yeah, it's very rare these days. Pretty much nobody's heard of it these days. It's an older system. Mm-hmm. What else have we used?
We have used Fate. We used Oubliette. I know, right, we did.
Which is based on Fate.
Yeah, which is based on Fate. So we've done a couple in Oubliette.
Oh, that's true. Actually, we had a long-running Oubliette game in Oubliette First Edition, which was based on a totally terrible, homebrewed system that was not up to snuff, but we made it work. Yeah. We made it happen, which is ironic, I guess.
Yeah, I think we kind of force of will got through that one and made it work out.
Just because it was a fascinating enough story that we were like, well, who really cares what the rules are like?
Yeah, we're just going to roll with this and make it work.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, honestly, most of the time it's just been Silcore.
Yeah.
Most of our long-running one-on-ones have been Silcore.
So let's talk a little bit about how to actually set up a one-on-one role-playing game and some things that you'll want to be aware of when it comes to how the whole process works.
Okay. So again, just tackling this we're going to tackle this from 1,000-foot view, whatever system that you're dealing with. If you are dealing with something with a traditional game, because a lot of people are just more comfortable in those kind of games. If you're dealing with a D&D style kind of game, then you will want to consider what direction you're going to go in order to handle the combat. You can totally do handling multiple characters. As we said, generally what that looks like is the GM has several NPC kind of followers for the party, and then in combat the player runs those characters while the GM runs the enemies. And it's not that difficult to kind of keep everybody's personalities and stuff in play when when you're running a big combat between that many people. It's just the GM generally steps in and says, this is the way this character feels about this thing.
Yeah, and then out of combat, then it's up to the GM to pick up a lot of that role-playing weight and really, run those characters as if you had 25 NPCs standing around. Right. Slight exaggeration.
Another possibility in the traditional games route is the Gestalt rules from 3.5, where you basically take multiple classes and join them together in a single character and basically make a character who's as good as maybe 1.5 characters. There's some certain overlaps and things, and then they get the powers of multiple classes, but they don't get extra hit points. They kind of top out at what is available to either class, and that'll get you some of the way there, but really that's only kind of a patch fix for normal single character encounter building, because that's really only going to make it less swingy. Not that character can handle more villains at the same time.
Yeah. So
we also just recently thought of a possibility for traditional style games one-on-one that we're calling chosen one mode, where basically you just build 4 characters and call them one character. It's complicated, and we haven't figured out the ins and outs of it and like the details of it yet. But the idea would basically be that your character has a pool of hit points equal to the total of all 4 character sheets. They have one set of stats. They've got one set of skills, but they have the abilities and powers and feats and stuff of all the different characters. And they have 4 actions if you're going to use 4 characters. So that way you're effectively making an entire team in one player character. So you could be like fireball, raise a skeleton, and then sword attack, right? As your set of actions. And honestly, it doesn't seem that outlandish because, I mean, there are plenty of editions of D&D where you can get tons and tons of attacks or bonus actions or whatever. But it sort of evens out the action economy and says, like, look, you're not really fundamentally building a different kind of set of encounters for the GM. You're going to go up against the same kind of stuff. It's just going to work a little bit differently.
Yeah, but we haven't tested this out yet, so we have no idea if it would actually work. But theoretically, I think it's pretty solid and pretty sound that it could work out. It
sounds like it would be kind of fun, especially because then you do get that whole chosen one sensation of like, my character is the hero of the story, and like I'm gonna go do some wicked, crazy, epic crap, like punch out a dragon by myself, kind of like that just sounds so badass, right? It sounds like heroic geek demigod stuff, and I want to do it. For generally speaking, for when you're not dealing with traditional games and you're talking about just the general ins and outs of this thing, you can also start thinking about what the story is between the character and the problem, right? You want to start thinking about what is the primary antagonist or issue in the world that the player is going to face, and how are they integrated into that problem. Liz ran a fairly short one-on-one for me where I was playing kind of a broken ace, like former commander of like a magic military unit, and it was basically post-war, and there was a bunch of like magic terrorism that was going on, and it turned out that I was like kind of a shoe-in for like investigating this stuff, and so that entire story and world even were kind of founded around the way my character was designed and the way I wanted my character to work as a person and as an entity in the game, right? Within the game rules, within the mechanics.
Yeah, and I think one thing to really think about with a one-on-one role-playing game when you're designing it and pulling it together is, make sure that your player is very closely tied in with everything that's going on, because that's really the advantage of it. Is you want to make sure that they're connected with what's around them, connected with the story, connected with the NPCs, put in old friends, put in family members, put in army buddies, whatever that connection is, to really pull your player into the story and make them, feel like they're an intimate part of that world in a way you can't do with a lot of group games.
Yeah, it would be kind of silly, like almost asinine to do one-on-one role playing and then the scenario that you're playing is like a module or something.
Yeah.
Because then you're kind of spectacularly missing the point. Like you could totally do a module, or you could try at least. Who knows whether you'd be able to succeed just based on the problems of the way the thing is built. But like you're missing out on the whole, like, this can be specifically tailored to the character, both in terms of how the game works in the mechanics, but also what the game content is in the story.
Yeah. And I think another thing to think about with one-on-one is you have a lot more flexibility when it comes to what type of things you're doing. I feel like a lot of times when I'm in a group role-playing game, there's a lot more combat, but when we're doing one-on-one, we're doing a lot less combat. And part of that's because, we're narrativists. We like to tell a story. But I think part of it's because doing something one-on-one really works very well to doing investigation
Right.
or politics or
Espionage.
Yeah, definitely things like that really
Investigation.
Yeah, that really let you kind of sink into the story a lot more.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid to have non-combat sessions,
Right.
and multiple non-combat sessions in a one-on-one game. Those can be just as interesting and just
Right.
as intriguing.
Right. And they often push the story forward more than any combat does, because combat just takes more time.
Yeah.
And the end result of combat is always we won or they won. And that doesn't really move the story forward that much, honestly.
No.
Unless you're, being very careful and making sure that every single fight that you're planning has some kind of specific outcome. Like, we have to stop the wizard from building his crystal or filling it with magic or whatever.
Yep.
Or like capturing civilians or whatever it is. So I hope you've kind of gotten the idea that one-on-one role-playing is viable, at least, that it's a thing that you can totally do. It's not completely outlandish. And it can really be advantageous and fun and exciting and very interesting in the right circumstances. You just have to make sure that you're not kind of shooting yourself in the foot or setting yourself up for failure, I would say.
Yeah, it's a great way to tell some very interesting stories in a way that you wouldn't be able to otherwise.
Right, and sometimes it's especially in our case, it can be your only recourse, right?
Yeah.
For role playing. If all you have is like one other friend, then at least you can role play with that one other friend, right?
Yep.
I'm Joe.
And I'm Liz.
This is Joe's Table signing off. See you next time, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Peace.